In February 1988, a 20-year-old woman was out working in Cardiff's Docklands district, an area known for its nightlife, poverty, and after-dark trade. Like many women trying to survive on the margins of society, she was out that night hoping to earn money and make it home safely by morning. Instead, she was subjected to a frenzied and brutal attack. By sunrise, Lynette White was dead, and the city was left horrified by the violence of her final moments. Police came under immense pressure to find the killer quickly, and in the rush for answers, detectives focused on a group of local men whose lives would soon be torn apart. Confessions were disputed, evidence was challenged, and allegations of police misconduct began to surface. Yet despite mounting concerns, 3 men were convicted and imprisoned for a crime they did not commit, while the real killer remained free for years. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, we're discussing the murder of Lynette White, one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in British legal history. It's a case involving corruption claims, false confessions, shattered lives, and the long fight to uncover the truth. It's the story of a young woman who lost her life and how justice was delayed for far too long. Before we begin, please take a moment to follow the show on your podcast platform of choice, subscribe on YouTube. It's a free and simple way to support British Murders and helps the podcast reach a wider audience. Reviews and ratings are always hugely appreciated, and if you want ad-free episodes, early access, and a range of exclusive content, you can support the show at patreon.com/British Murders. This is, without question, one of the most complex cases I've ever covered on this podcast. But, as always, I've done my best to present it in the clearest, most straightforward way possible, so it's as easy to follow as it can be. We'll start by introducing the person whose life was taken at such a young age and whom the story essentially revolves around. Lynette Deborah White was born on July 5, 1967 in Wales's capital city of Cardiff, and it's there where she grew up and lived. Her childhood was a rather difficult one, as her mum left home when she was a young child. The result of that meant Lynette stayed with her dad Terry for a period of time, but even that wasn't without its own frustrations. Terry earned a living working as a lorry driver, and given he now had sole custody of Lynette, she was forced to accompany him on the road, sleeping in the truck and travelling all over the country. Lynette also went through a period of living with her grandma until she passed away. After that, she had to look for her own place to live. I think it's fair to say she had an unstable childhood and early life. An old school friend of Lynette said she was a very shy girl and never got in any trouble. She was seemingly a lovely person who could do no wrong. Another friend of hers said Lynette was a small girl, very petite, and that she liked buying clothes on the rare chance she was able to get them. She was also a keen dancer who had a passion for music. She enjoyed letting herself go and having fun. The East Cardiff district of Rumney was where Lynette specifically grew up, and by all accounts it was a lovely place to live in. Locals were the sort who felt comfortable leaving the doors unlocked or even open because everyone knew each other, and crime was not something that typically occurred there. After leaving school, Lynette left home shortly after turning 18, moving to the Butetown area south of the city centre. It's also known as the Docks and Tiger Bay. Butetown has a bit of a reputation for being a fairly rough area, with many online commentators saying it's not somewhere you'd want to walk alone at night. I've never been, so I've no idea if that's accurate or not, though a lot of similar areas with a so-called bad rep are often nowhere near as bad as people who've never lived there or even near there make out. Either way, Lynette eventually ended up earning around £100 per night in the area as a sex worker, with reports suggesting she did so to support her boyfriend's cocaine addiction. Stephen Miller, who had the nickname Pineapple, was the boyfriend in question, and he lived with Lynette in a flat located on Dorset Street over in Grangetown. That's a mile or so northwest of Butetown. Some reports state that Stephen was not a fan of Lynette taking on such work and continually attempted to get her to stop, whereas others categorically state that he was her pimp who she feared and that he had been seen punching and kicking her. According to Stephen, the couple would erupt into rows about her sex work, and he even offered to sit around the corner from where she worked to make sure she was safe. Lynette supposedly argued that it would look like he was her pimp and deter any potential customers as well as attracting the police. While out working, she seemingly kept to herself rather than ingratiating with fellow sex workers, with some of the other women recalling how she did what she needed to do and then headed straight home. The Buttetown community knew Lynette as a lovable and gentle character, with one of her male friends saying she was like one of the boys. He further added that she had hopes and dreams like anyone else and didn't plan on doing sex work forever. She had aspirations of becoming a doctor, he said, and was only doing sex work to get back on her feet. But others said she had an aura of sadness about her, with a former cab driver at the time saying it was because she lived in fear of Stephen, who the driver said took all her money to pay for his drug habits and turned her from a bubbly young woman into a shell of her former self. Our main timeline started on February 9th, 1988, because it was on that day that Lynette suddenly went missing. She didn't contact Stephen or her other known associates for the next 5 days, which was a massive worry. The alarm was raised by a friend of hers due to the lack of contact, but neither her whereabouts during that period nor the reason for her disappearance have ever been established. The next crucial day in the story is Sunday, February 14th, 1988, Valentine's Day. On that day, Lynette was using a flat, number 7 James Street in Buttetown's red light district, which a friend and fellow sex worker called Leanne Vilde had allowed her to see clients in. The flat was based above a betting shop, and its location did not please one particular client who had paid Lynette £30 up front before changing his mind after seeing the place and demanding a refund. We'll talk more about him later. Now, because Lynette had the only set of keys to the flat, it meant that the friend who loaned them to her could not access it herself, and given Lynette had seemingly disappeared for the past 5 days, there was no way Leanne could access the flat. Despite gaining access to the building's main door thanks to the efforts of another resident, there was still no access to the actual flat. So Leanne, as well as a taxi driver, headed to Buttetown Police Station to not only explain the situation, but to report Lynette as missing. A couple of officers from the station then accompanied them back to the flat, because, as it happens, Lynette was wanted by the police anyway due to no showing a court case she was due to be a witness at. The officers forced entry to the flat shortly after 9 p.m. and was soon met with the horrifying discovery of Lynette's badly injured body. Her wristwatch had stopped working at around 1:45 a.m., which police considered to be the likely time of her death. The attack was an extremely violent one which saw Lynette suffering 69 wounds in total, including stab wounds to her face, neck, chest, stomach, breasts, wrists, and thighs. Her throat had also been slit so deeply that the bones of her spine were exposed and her left breast was almost completely severed. This seemed to be an incredibly personal attack, and despite Lynette's best attempts to defend herself, as confirmed by her many defensive wounds, she was no match for a killer. The forensic pathologist who conducted the post-mortem said she'd been subjected to a mutilating attack with sexual overtones, and although Lynette was fully clothed except for one shoe, the motive was thought to be sexual. The murder weapon was believed to be a 6-inch blade, but it was never recovered by the police. In the press, they called the attack a vicious frenzy, adding that it was carried out by a sadistic person using a sharp instrument. A day after Lynette's body was found, officers turned to a close circle of friends, and when it came to her boyfriend, Stephen Miller, he quickly became their first suspect and was picked up for questioning. Stephen was a young black man who'd been in a relationship with Lynette for about 2 years at the time of her murder. A key fact about his personal background, and one that became central to the miscarriage of justice, was his intellectual vulnerability. Miller was said to have a mental age of 11, which made him particularly susceptible to the pressured interrogation he was later subjected to. His friends said he was mellow and slightly immature for his age, and when he was arrested, Stephen said he understood why they took him in for questioning because he was Lynette's partner. He added that he believed the police thought he was pimping off her, and in his own words admitted that he was a hustler who sold weed and took cocaine, though he insisted that did not mean he was a murderer. The police took away the clothes Stephen was wearing on the night Lynette was murdered, yet after extensive testing, there was nothing that linked him to the crime. And he also had an alibi regarding his whereabouts on the night in question, which was corroborated. Brent Parry, a former Detective Chief Inspector for South Wales Police, said they were satisfied with the explanation Stephen gave at the time, and he was therefore no longer considered a suspect. With that, he was released from custody and told to ask around for information, a task he agreed to. A week or so after the murder, information stemming from witness testimony was coming in at a rapid pace. One woman reported seeing a man wearing jeans sitting outside the flat at James Street who appeared to be bleeding. Several other witnesses described seeing a white man near the murder scene with blood on his hands. Another witness said she saw a man out of breath and with a bandaged wound on his hand. This man, who I must reiterate was described as being white by multiple witnesses, then became the police's main suspect. They handed out a sketch artist rendition of what they believed it looked like and proceeded to massively ramp up the investigation, which included the sketch being used on an episode of Crime Watch. They began to conduct house-to-house inquiries and were quoted at the time saying they were keeping an open mind as to the motive. But as the anxiety in the community began to increase, so did the pressure on the police. They had organised forensic testing to take place on Lynette's blood and a minor amount of blood from someone else left at the murder scene. Police were also trying to get assistance from the community, but they struggled getting Lynette's previous clients to open up, because it was a rather sensitive topic which many found embarrassing to discuss. 2 months after she was killed on April 17, 1988, Lynette's family and friends gathered to pay their last respects to the woman they loved. Shortly after, in the spring of that year, 7 black men were arrested in connection with Lynette's murder. They were questioned and blood tested against samples recovered from the scene, but none of the samples matched, leaving the police with no serious leads. Despite that, police pursued a theory that a group of local men were responsible. There were 5 names in particular which caught their attention, the first being Stephen Miller, who we've discussed already. Next was Yusuf Abdullahi, who was born in 1961 and grew up in Butetown. Since the 19th century, Butetown had been home to families descended from Somalia, Yemen, West Africa, the Caribbean, and Malta, most of whom were seafarers who had come to work at the docks. And the name Abdullahi placed Yusuf squarely within that older Somali Welsh tradition of Dockland Cardiff. He came from a large extended family rooted in Butetown's tightly packed streets, and in later life was himself the head of a household which included older sons, a common-law partner, and 2 younger children born after his release from prison. Family, Butetown, and the sea were the 3 constants in his life. His personality was made up of a kind of quiet dignity, with a dry, defiant sense of humour. Those who knew him described a man who was mild rather than showy. He was deeply loyal, and more comfortable offering quiet support than outlandish speeches. Friends recalled him as being a dependable, unassuming presence in the Butetown community long before his arrest. A young man who was respected for his work on the ships, for keeping out of trouble, and for the way he looked after his relatives and neighbours. By the time of Lynette's murder, Yusuf had built his working life around Cardiff's diminishing but still active docks, earning a living as a merchant seaman. Crucially, at the moment Lynette was being killed, Yusuf was not even in Cardiff. He was on board the MV Coral Sea, a cargo ship berthed roughly 8 miles away in Barry Docks. On May 19, 1988, Detective Inspector Richard Powell took a formal statement from Youssef in which he explained about his duties on the ship and the timings that placed him away from the crime scene, an alibi which, under any remotely competent investigation, should have been decisive. Earlier that day, while intoxicated, Leanne Vilde, who I mentioned earlier, had named Stephen and Youssef as being Lynette's killers in front of several other sex workers. Hence, the police went on to arrest and take a statement from Youssef, as I've just said. But Leanne later told a sergeant that same evening that it had been a false accusation, saying it was the result of drunken rambling, and that she had heard the names from D.I. Powell when he had questioned her earlier in the day. Despite her retraction, she went on to give evidence against the accused men at the trial. The next person arrested was Tony Paris, who also grew up in Buttetown. Tony had a brother and sister who were frequently mentioned in the family's public statements during and after the case. They were a close-knit Cardiff family who sat through long prison visits, hearings, and eventually campaign meetings together. Tony was living an unremarkable working-class life on the edge of Tiger Bay at the time Lynette was killed, and he wasn't exactly a stranger to the local police. Even so, he never did anything as serious as murder. Court records and press accounts describe a brief history of petty crimes, such as shoplifting or a driving fine. What is striking is what the police themselves said about his character. Contemporary and later reports noted that Tony was known to the police as being notoriously non-violent, which is precisely the opposite of the profile a reasonable detective would look for in the man who had stabbed a young woman to death more than 50 times. At the time of the murder, when the story broke on the news, Tony said to his partner, "Whoever they get for this is in big trouble." Little did he know that he himself would soon be accused of committing said crime. Tony was also already a dad himself before he was arrested, with reports stating he had 2 children from the earlier part of his life. He was the kind of guy whose life would ordinarily never have touched a murder investigation in any way. Ronnie Acte is the next person I need to introduce. He also lived in Buttetown, and at the time of Lynette's murder, Ronnie was the boyfriend of Leanne Vilde, the person whose flat Lynette was killed in and who'd lent her the keys to it. And that personal link was part of what pulled Ronnie into the investigation. As with Tony, Ronnie was already known to the police, but once more, only for petty crimes. John Acte was also one of the arrested men, and based on his surname, I'm sure you've clocked that yes, he was related to Ronnie. They were cousins. They grew up together within the same community, and John was a big personality in the area. He stood 6 feet plus and was an ex-rugby player with a build to match. He worked as a debt collector, and consequently, the police were always looking for an excuse to arrest him because they saw him as a gangster. To their frustration, John would always walk free after being taken in. The police hated him, a former officer said, adding that they were very keen to put him down for Lynette's murder. At the time, he had just had a baby, but even so, DCI John Williams, who led the murder investigation, said, "I don't think anyone in the Dockland will shed any tears if or when he is put away." Fast forward to November 1988, and a woman called Violet Perriam, who worked as a receptionist at the Buttetown Health Centre, came forward as a possible witness. Violet claimed that at around 1 a.m. on February 14th, remember that Lynette's watch stopped at 1:45 a.m., she drove past the flat and remembered she'd seen 4 men outside on the street. Despite seeing them from behind, she identified one of them as maybe being John Acte, and she said she recognized him from the health centre. Then, in a case which was unrelated, the police took blood samples from Angela Saylor. I may be saying that wrong. P-S-A-I-L-A. I think it's Saylor. She was another sex worker and was told her sample matched a blood sample recovered from the flat at James Street where Lynette was murdered. The sample was, in fact, type AB, the same as hers. but it wasn't hers. That blood type also has a connection to someone referred to only as Mr. X, who was seemingly a man who lived close to James Street and was known to be a convicted sex offender with a plethora of mental health issues. DNA analysis would later rule him out as a suspect, however. And even though there was no match with Angela's blood, she was brought in for an interview regardless. She lived in a flat at St. Clair's Court, which had an unrestricted view of the front of number 7 James Street, and was described later as one of the most vulnerable members of Cardiff society. She had an IQ of just 55, around half the average of 100, indicating she was an individual with learning disabilities. She shared her flat at one point with her friend, the aforementioned Leanne Vilde, who was eventually asked to leave by Angela due to the near-daily police visits she was receiving during the murder investigation. Leanne later claimed that Detective Inspector Graham Mountcher had threatened her with prosecution for the murder, telling her that her young son would be orphaned if she kept saying she knew nothing. Ultimately, she said she had no choice but to provide an account of what happened, regardless of whether it was a lie or not. Leanne was a single parent with substance abuse problems who was later described, like the other key witnesses, as being among Cardiff's most vulnerable people. After being kicked out of Angela's place, Leanne began lodging with another couple, who also complained that the police were calling round to speak with her on an almost daily basis. By that point, detectives had taken over 3,000 statements, which is quite an achievement given the people of Butetown didn't want to tell the police much about their lives. They feared it would be used against them. Stephen claimed that at that time, police cars would speed by shouting things at people, such as the N-word, or, forgive me and remember I'm quoting, black bastard, which understandably created a hostile relationship between the civilians and the police. There was apparently a huge amount of racism from the police aimed at the locals, and it bred not only fear, but a strong disliking of those in authority. The police station in Butetown was known as the Wild West at the time, very rough and ready, with DCI Williams only showing his face when a serious crime had been committed. The officers seemingly had little sympathy for sex workers, who were frequently physically assaulted by their clients, and the word misogyny was thrown around in many of the resources used to research this case. One former officer said that if someone suggested a name on a gut feeling for a crime, the officers would go and arrest them, arguing that 90% of the time they were probably right. In those days, it was a case of arresting someone first, then trying to build the evidence around the case. A series of arrests then took place on December 7, 1988, including those of Stephen Miller, Youssef Abdullahi, and Ronnie Akhti. John Akhti and Tony Paris were then arrested 2 days later, and the 5 of them were interviewed in connection with Lynette's murder. Stephen, who we already know was a vulnerable man, was interviewed 19 times over a 4-day period, totaling roughly 13 hours. He was denied access to a solicitor during his first 2 interviews, and crucially denied murdering Lynette 307 times before eventually producing a confession. In another room, the police reportedly told Youssef, "You're a disgrace to the human race." Tony's interview included the police scaring him, slamming their hands on the table and shouting. They gave very graphic details about Lynette's body in the post-mortem, and even showed photos of her, which traumatized him greatly. Yet all 5 men provided alibis for the night of the murder, leaving the police frustrated once more. Attempting to mold evidence around the story they wished to peddle, the police's belief of events was as follows. The men went to the flat and killed Lynette to teach her a lesson. After 4 days of being held, the men were under very intense circumstances. They couldn't sleep or eat properly, and the interviewing officers would manipulate the men against each other, saying others had placed the blame on them. Youssef continued his alibi that he was on the cargo ship working at the time of the murder, and he said that more than 500 times according to some reports. All the while, the officers were telling him what they believed he had done as per the accounts of Angela and Leanne. The police focused more on Stephen because they thought he was the closest to Lynette, so therefore he would know more. On the tape, the officers said, "You hold the key to this inquiry now. We're going to have the truth out of you." Stephen then shockingly confessed to the murder after days of interrogation. He said on the tape, "I think Leanne came in. She started shouting. She said something to someone, she ran out, and after that, all I can tell is Tony went fucking crazy, man. So I started stabbing, do you know what I mean?" He also implicated the others in the killing. So with that, the 5 men, Stephen, Youssef, Tony, Ronnie and John, were formally charged with Lynette's murder, even though none of the forensic evidence from the scene matched any of them. They were held on remand for nearly a year before their trial finally commenced in October 1989 at Swansea Crown Court before Mr. Justice McNeill. In his opening speech, case prosecutor David Elfer set the scene of what the prosecution believed happened. This was the first chance for them to sway the jury. David was perpetuating a myth about Butte Town to people who weren't aware of their own racism, selling the defendants to the jury as animals. He said the town they came from was an upside-down place. The judge had already told the court, "You're going to see people that come from a totally different background," adding that people from the dockland carry knives just as casually as you'd carry your coat, all in an attempt to try and paint a picture of people who were violent criminals. It's worth noting here for some historical context that, in Swansea, many people hadn't seen anyone who was black before at that time. The population was 222,192, with only 446 black people contributing to that total figure. As the trial pressed on, the case was essentially built on nothing but hearsay, as none of the men were in the area at the time of the murder. The witnesses' stories did not add up, but any inconsistencies were put down to the length of time passed since the murder occurred. Leanne and Angela gave evidence, with the latter being incredibly racist in the terminology she used to describe the 5 defendants. I'm not prepared to repeat what she said in this podcast. In a strange twist, Mr. Justice McNeill suddenly passed away after a heart attack in February 1990, which led to the trial being stopped. It's believed at that point, based on the lack of evidence, the 5 men would likely have been freed as the trial was approaching its conclusion and was going in their favour. But 3 months later, the retrial opened once more at Swansea Crown Court on May 14th, this time before Mr. Justice Leonard. The prosecutors made different statements to the first trial and changed their story and their facts to undermine the evidence. Angela now told the court her account was not true and was just what she believed the police wanted her to say. She said she was scared of the police and what they would do to her if she didn't comply. Police interviews with Stephen were shown to a forensic psychologist who gave evidence for the defense. They noted that the interviews sometimes had a calm, friendly police presence, but it was all a manipulation tactic. The officers soon escalated to shouting at Stephen, scaring him in the process. Eventually, they would send nicer police back in. Such was the stereotypical good cop, bad cop routine, and they were the officers Stephen confessed to because he felt safer with them. The psychologist said in court, "There is no doubt in my mind that bearing in mind the type, intensity and duration of the police pressure, the reliability of the content of the interviews must be considered to be unsafe and unsatisfactory." For his testimony, the prosecution told him he was in cloud cuckoo land, which he took great offense to. On November 20th, 1990, DCI John Williams retired, and just 2 days later, the jury found Stephen, Youssef and Tony guilty of Lynette's murder, leading to them becoming known forever as the Cardiff Three. Cousins Ronnie and John were each found not guilty, so were free to leave the court while the others were taken into custody. Tony and Youssef's brothers started the wrongful conviction campaign after the verdicts and pushed for media attention to highlight what was a massive miscarriage of justice. Journalists took their side, arguing that there was enough doubt to not put those 3 men in prison, The appeal against the Cardiff Three sentences would be heard in December 1992, but just weeks before it was due to commence, Tony Paris's dad, Arthur, who was a central figure in his life, passed away aged 65. Tony was escorted from prison in the company of an officer so he could say some form of a goodbye to his dad in the hospital, but he was not allowed to attend the funeral. Tony firmly believed that the stress of him being in prison is what led to his dad's death. As the appeal date approached, human rights barrister Michael Mansfield QC agreed to take the case, going through all of the tapes in preparation for the hearing. Michael said, "There was no scientific evidence that connected Miller or any of the others to the scene, and there's plenty left there. There's blood all over the place. Listening to the tapes, I was so shocked by what I heard. I thought that I can't really believe any appeal court judge will listen to this and not be moved and not be horrified by what they hear." The hearing took place across 4 days that December, with the panel being led by then Lord Chief Justice Lord Taylor of Gosforth. It began with Michael presenting those controversial interview tapes after Lord Taylor ruled they could be played in the courtroom. The court, which was so silent you could hear a pin drop, heard Stephen confess, but only after hearing him deny having anything to do with Lynette's murder over 300 times first. It was clear that the officers had pressured him into confessing to a crime he did not commit. On December 10th, Lord Taylor had heard enough, and the Court of Appeal proceeded to quash the convictions of Stephen, Youssef, and Tony. It's heartbreaking to hear, not only because they were wrongly convicted, but because of what happened to Tony's dad. Lord Taylor summed up by saying the police had bullied and hectored Stephen during what was a travesty of an interview. He added that, short of physical violence, it was hard to conceive of a more hostile and intimidating approach by officers to a suspect. The confession was ruled as being irrelevant and was ultimately rejected as evidence. The 3 men were now finally free after spending 4 years behind bars for a crime they had nothing to do with. Youssef said, "We were just used as scapegoats for the police, who couldn't find anything else or anybody else to pin this crime on." Tony added to that, saying, "The police can't do their job. Something's got to be done about it. They're taking liberty with innocent people's lives." Former DCI John Williams then said, "I think that the officers were there to get the truth, and that is what their duty was. In some instances, some people have to be shouted at. Some people have to be spoken to quietly. That is the way interviews go." Youssef returned to Butte Town and over time settled back into domestic life with his common-law partner, but the time spent in prison left a permanent mark on him. He was subsequently diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and was hospitalized after a nervous breakdown. His solicitor later recalled that Youssef found it difficult to come to terms with life even after he was formally cleared of any wrongdoing. He spent much of the 1990s and 2000s as a visible campaigner, lobbying persistently for the Lynette White murder to be reinvestigated. He also spoke publicly on behalf of others who had suffered miscarriages of justice. Youssef passed away in January 2011, dying of a perforated ulcer at the age of 49. His funeral was held at St. Mary's Church on Butte Street, the spiritual heart of Butte Town, on February 1st, 2011, with interment at Western Cemetery. Friends, family, former co-defendants, fellow campaigners, and members of the broader Cardiff community gathered to pay their respects to a man who had spent the second half of his life refusing to accept that the wrongs done to him and his co-accused should be quietly forgotten. The 4 years Tony spent in prison were, by every account, the defining trauma of his life. He would later tell his daughter that he still remembered vividly watching other men hang themselves on the wing. He said he simply could not believe he was being held among murderers and paedophiles when he was innocent, adding that the sheer cognitive dissonance of it never fully went away. But freedom, for him, did not mean rejoining the noisy world. Those closest to him said that Tony Paris, who came out of prison in December 1992, was not the same man who'd been taken from Buttetown 4 years earlier. He had also developed what his family and supporters described as post-traumatic stress disorder, and he dealt with it in the most private way possible, by deliberately scaling down the size of his social circle. He didn't like being around people afterwards, according to his daughter and friends, and kept himself largely to family and a small group of very close friends. Tony passed away on September 11, 2022, aged 65, after a period of ill health. His daughter announced the news on Twitter, as it was known at the time, and tributes flooded in from campaigners and lawyers, Buttetown community figures, fellow exonerees, and eventually from Parliament itself. An early day motion called Remembering Tony Parris was tabled on September 23, 2022, to mourn and place on the House of Commons record the loss and Tony's fight for justice. As for Miller, as of 2021, he is still alive, though he opened up in an interview that year saying he's unable to go back to Cardiff more than 3 decades later. But if the Cardiff Three were innocent and got released, who on earth killed Lynette, I hear you ask? We must go back to 1992 after the three men's release to find out. Initially, the police refused to reopen the investigation, with many believing the reason was because they still believed Stephen, Youssef and Tony were guilty. For years afterwards, suspicion didn't just go away, and there was no attempt to find out who really killed Lynette. Even Terry, Lynette's dad, was convinced the Cardiff Three had killed his daughter, but the person responsible for everything we've just been through was none other than that client of Lynette's who paid her £30 in advance, then demanded she give it back to him after seeing the flat at James Street on Valentine's Day 1988. His name? Jeffrey Charles Gaffour. Gaffour was born in Cardiff on May 29, 1965, and was the youngest of 5 children to his parents Royce Abdul and Jeanette Gaffour. His dad was of South Asian descent, whereas his mother was Welsh, and for a living, the couple were traders, running a food shop, which would become the backdrop to Gaffour's quiet adolescence and early adulthood. The family home was in the heart of the working-class Cardiff districts of Splot and later Ely. Both parts of the city were dominated in Gaffour's childhood years by steelworks, terraced streets, and tight-knit immigrant communities. Contemporary newspaper profiles described his childhood as unremarkable in the politest way possible. No obvious trauma, no trouble with the authorities, no warning signs of what he was capable of. He was, however, already showing the introverted streak which would define him, and he was often referred to as Gaffour the Loner. Former schoolmates and relatives told reporters after his conviction that even as a boy he had very few friends, and that he quite literally had none at all as an adult. At the age of 17 in the early 1980s, Gaffour joined a youth opportunity program in Buttetown, which was a Thatcher-era government training scheme for unemployed school leavers. His placement there gave him his first real taste of working life beyond the family shop, while also placing him physically in the very streets where, 5 years later, he would meet Lynette White. Throughout his late teens and early 20s, Gaffour revolved around his parents' shop, with him seemingly working in various roles, including behind the counter, stacking shelves, and doing the ordinary chores of a small grocer's. His sister, the relative who spoke most openly to journalists after his arrest, summed up his lifestyle with unusual bluntness. She said he didn't drink, smoke, or do drugs, and no one in the family could recall him ever having a girlfriend. At the time of Lynette's murder, a 22-year-old Gaffour was still living at his parents' home, quietly filling his days with shop work, television, and books. One of the stranger moments in his early working life was a spell in Germany. The exact dates of his stay are not widely reported, but it is known that it was during his 20s. Colleagues there reportedly teased him mercilessly about pornography, which he found so genuinely upsetting that he would become visibly offended and annoyed whenever the subject arose. He never sought female company or formed a romantic relationship on the trip, and returned to Cardiff apparently as solitary as when he'd left. Whatever that period on the continent says about his inner life, it fits the picture that his relatives painted. That of an intelligent but emotionally stunted young man who seemed to recoil from intimacy. Ghaffur's fragile connection to his family broke in 1993 when his mum died. After her death, he left the family home and steadily drifted apart from his siblings. For a time, he lived in the back of a van, and after that in a succession of small flats around Cardiff and in the South Wales valleys. His work kept pace with his lifestyle. From the early 90s onwards, he took a string of jobs as a security guard, often working 12-hour shifts overnight on building sites, car parks, and industrial premises. The work gave him exactly what he wanted: long stretches of solitude, minimal contact with the public, and time to be left alone with his books and his thoughts. It was during that security guard period in July 1992 that he picked up his only criminal conviction prior to the murder. In a minor dispute during a shift, he hit a fellow security guard over the head with half a brick. He pleaded guilty at Cardiff Crown Court to unlawful wounding and was ordered to complete 80 hours community service. The inquiry into Lynette's murder was then reopened in 1995 in light of advances in forensic science, which coincided with the introduction of the UK's national DNA database that same year. Bill Hacking, a former head of Lancashire Police CID, was appointed as the reviewing officer, but the reinvestigation quickly hit a stumbling block because South Wales Police insisted on testing every available sample with early multiplex methods, wasting precious DNA in the process. By the turn of the millennium, a fresh forensic review was carried out, and there was plenty of evidence to go through. There were 900 pieces in total, and on a single weekend, the assigned officers went through all of them. Sadly, none of it led to anything. The police went back to the flat to picture what it was like on the night of her murder, and while looking through photos of the scene, they spotted a cellophane cigarette wrapper on the floor which hadn't yet been tested for DNA. On that wrapper was foreign blood, i.e. it didn't belong to Lynette, so therefore it likely belonged to a killer. The police consequently referred to the person that DNA belonged to as the cellophane man. A skirting board was taken from the flat and examined by Forensic Alliance. As luck would have it, the board hadn't fit very well, and there was a little gap behind it. Consequently, some blood just so happened to have landed on the top of the gap and dripped down. Literally a microscopic flake of dried blood, which was recovered from underneath 2 layers of newer paint. In total, 10 traces of the same blood were found on the skirting board, which matched that of the cellophane man. By September 2000, an independent review into unsolved murders in South Wales had cleared the way for the case to be formally reopened by South Wales Police. By January 2001, Ghaffur was renting a terraced house on Bridgend Road in Llanharan, a village between Bridgend and Pontyclun, that offered him the invisibility of somewhere small and unremarkable. Neighbours would later tell reporters that they'd barely seen him, adding that he would only speak to them out of necessity. One person described him almost like a rumour in the streets, curtains always drawn, lights on at odd hours, nothing more than a shape that occasionally moved to and from his car. A year later, and the Cardiff Three plus Ronnie and John Acte had offered to donate their DNA samples to be compared to the profile recovered from the murder scene via an independent lab. They didn't want their samples going anywhere near a police station, understandably. Each came back as not being a match, further cementing their innocent statuses. When the profile was ran against the national database, there were no matches, but one of the teams suggested you could cross-reference the DNA to a family match, which narrowed the case down to around 600 matches in the area. Using the newly available second-generation multiplex plus DNA test, SGM+, a bit of a mouthful, Angela Gallup and her team at Forensic Alliance managed to obtain a partial familial match against the profile of a 14-year-old boy whose DNA had been added to the database for an unrelated juvenile offence. He wasn't even born when Lynette was killed, so he clearly wasn't a killer. Exploring the familial links, DNA samples were first taken from his mum and dad. When compared to the killer's DNA, it was close, but not a perfect match. Then, in February 2003, the 14-year-old boy's uncle was tested. And bingo, a perfect match. The boy's estranged uncle was Jeffrey Gaffor. That was the first time in British legal history that a case was solved through a familial search of the National DNA Database. On February 28th, Gaffor was arrested after a firearms unit burst through his doors when he did not respond to their knocking. It was obvious he had attempted to take his own life by swallowing an overdose of paracetamol, so he was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. He then confessed to killing Lynette while on the way to the hospital, and with that, the police formally apologised to the Cardiff Three in July. When police searched Gaffor's house after his arrest, what they found was, in its way, as curious as the man himself. The shelves held around 10 Bibles, alongside dozens of notebooks filled with codes that officers and analysts were unable to decipher. Gaffor seemed to have spent his long, empty hours in a private world of scripture, cryptography, and solitude. None of the material recovered from the house has been made public, though, and the content of the notebooks remains, more than 2 decades on, unknown. Gaffor pleaded guilty to Lynette's murder on July 4, 2003 at Cardiff Crown Court before Mr. Justice Royce. It was revealed that, upon his arrest, Gaffor had said, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." Mr. Justice Royce imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 12 years and 8 months. But even so, there are still police officers and civilians who firmly believe the Cardiff Three were the ones who murdered Lynette, even though the case against Gaffor is airtight. In November 2004, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, announced it would supervise a fresh investigation by South Wales Police into the original murder inquiry. And just 6 months later, 5 retired police officers were arrested on suspicion of false imprisonment, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and misconduct in public office. 4 more retired officers were arrested less than 10 days later, we're in April 2005 at this point, in connection with their roles in the original murder investigation. In fact, over the course of around 12 months, 30 or so people were arrested in connection with it, about 19 of whom were serving or retired police officers. As we've discussed, Leanne and Angela became key prosecution witnesses in the original murder trial, giving statements after prolonged police questioning that later proved to be false. Well, in February 2007, 4 witnesses who gave evidence at said trial were charged with perjury. In December 2008, the 3 main civilian witnesses, that's Angela, Leanne, and a man called Mark Gromick, were found guilty of committing perjury and each were sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Prosecutors later accepted that Mark had told the truth for 8 months before changing his account under extreme pressure from the police. In 2009, 13 former South Wales police officers, including former DI Graham Mountcher and 2 civilians, were charged with some very serious offences, including conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and perjury. 2 years later, in July 2011, the trial of 8 former officers opened at Swansea Crown Court, and it was the biggest prosecution of police officers of its kind. The case is formally listed as R v Mountcher and others, but in December of that year, the Mountcher trial collapsed. The prosecuting counsel told the court he had lost confidence in the disclosure process and that the prosecution offered no evidence. As a result, the defendants were formally acquitted. Central to the collapse was evidence held by the IPCC concerning civil actions against South Wales Police, which was not disclosed to the defence. and the court was told it had been destroyed. The collapse case cost a reported £906,000 and change, with the Home Office saying the cost reflected the complexity of the investigation. In February 2015, then Home Secretary Theresa May announced a QC-led investigation into the collapse of the Mountshire trial, which was followed 2 years later by Richard Horwell QC's publishing of the Mountshire Investigation Report, which is available to view online. Richard concluded that the trial collapsed because of human errors by South Wales Police and the Crown Prosecution Service, rather than any deliberate cover-up. He described what happened as an embarrassment on a national scale and a series of disclosure catastrophes. In June 2021, the parole board held Guffor's first parole review after the expiry of his minimum tariff. It was ruled he was not suitable for release, but recommended he remain in open conditions. By January 2023, Guffor was in an open prison and allowed out on day release. Between 2023 and 2024, Guffor was denied release at several parole review hearings. Lynette's family and some of the wrongly convicted men's relatives publicly opposed his release and called for his parole hearings to be held in public. At Guffor's sixth parole review, which was held in private on October 3, 2024, the parole board directed his release. The panel concluded the risk he posed could be safely managed in the community and noted his behaviour in prison had been very good, with no violence in custody and multiple rehabilitative programs completed. Shortly after, in late 2024, the Ministry of Justice confirmed Guffor had been released from prison more than 21 years into his life sentence. He remains on licence for the rest of his life under intensive probation supervision and faces immediate recall to prison if he breaches his conditions. Lynette's family said they felt betrayed by the decision. Tony Paris's daughter and investigative journalist Satish Sarkar campaigned for a Lynette's law that would require killers to give a full account of their motives before they can be paroled. But to date, it has not been enacted. Thanks so much for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues, a longer episode than usual this one, but I'm sure you can appreciate that. It's a rather complex story to tell. There's a lot going on there. To access ad-free episodes, early releases, and exclusive content, visit patreon.com/British Murders. You can also support the show by simply following British Murders on your podcast app or heading to YouTube and subscribing. It helps more than you might realise. And as always, ratings and reviews are greatly appreciated. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.